That morning, the town no longer existed. Clara Whitmore stood at the mouth of the stone house, looking down into a valley that had become a single white sheet, seamless from the ridge to the frozen creek, broken only by the black stubs of chimney tops and the bent finger of a flagpole. No smoke rose anywhere but from her own hearth behind her. The wind had died in the night, and the silence that followed it was worse than the storm had been. She counted the chimneys she could see. She had counted them every morning for 11 days, and this was the first morning the number did not change, because there was nothing left standing tall enough to fall. She would go down soon. First, she needed a moment more to be only a woman looking at what she had built before she became again a woman who had to save what other people had refused to build. 3 years earlier, she had not owned a coat warm enough for this. The stagecoach that brought Clara and Edmund Whitmore into Larkspur Gulch arrived on a Tuesday in the last week of September 1879, 3 days behind schedule on account of a washed-out crossing at Bitter Creek. Clara remembered the date because she had written it along with the mileage and the condition of the road into the small ledger she kept for reasons she could not always explain to Edmund, who found the habit endearing and slightly troubling in equal measure. "You record the road the way other women record their children's heights," he said, watching her write by lamplight in the coach. "The road told me something the children's heights wouldn't," she said. "There's granite under this whole basin. I could feel it through the wheels." He laughed not unkindly and went back to his book, a worn copy of Parkman he had read perhaps a dozen times. Edmund Whitmore was a professor of history formerly of a small college in Ohio, dismissed not for scandal, but for a persistent, and in the trustees' view, tiresome insistence that the college teach the history of ordinary tradesmen alongside the history of generals. He had come west telling himself it was for research, a study of frontier settlement patterns he intended to publish. But Clara knew, and did not say aloud, that he had come because there was nothing left for him in Ohio, and because he trusted her instincts more than he trusted his own. Larkspur Gulch sat in a fold of the Bitterroot foothills, a silver camp 2 years old, and already calling itself a town with a bank, a mercantile, a Methodist church under construction, and 11 saloons that had somehow gone up faster than the church. The buildings were raw lumber, unweathered, the color of a fresh wound. Clara looked at them from the window of the coach and felt the particular unease she always felt looking at wood pretending to be permanent. Her father had been a stonemason in Cornwall before he brought his family to Pennsylvania, and he had put a level and a plumb line in her hands before he put a doll there. He had died when she was 19 in the collapse of a retaining wall. He had warned the foreman was unsound and had been buried under the very stone he had tried to save other men from. Clara had gone on to study what few schools would teach a woman in the way of structural drawing, had corrected the mathematics of 2 bridge engineers in Pittsburgh, who never learned the corrections were hers, and had built under her own name, at last, a fortification wall for a rail depot in the Alleghenies that still stood dry-jointed 20 years on. She was 43 years old and had buried a father, a stillborn son, and most of the patience she once had for men who mistook her quietness for want of opinion. She had not come to Larkspur Gulch to build anything. She had come because Edmund needed a town with a library subscription and clean water, and this one against all odds had both. But on the second morning, walking the ridge above the gulch while Edmund made calls on the assayer's office, she found the rock face. It rose perhaps 90 feet above the north side of the valley, a fold of pale gray granite shouldering out from the hillside like something the mountain had meant to finish and abandon. Scrub pine grew in the cracks. A seam of quartz ran diagonally through it, catching the morning light in a way that made the whole face seem for a moment to be breathing. Clara stood beneath it for the better part of an hour, doing nothing that anyone watching would have called useful, simply reading it the way her father had taught her to read stone for grain, for fault lines, for the places where it wanted to be cut, and the places where it would refuse. By noon, she had walked the property line twice and asked 3 different men in town who owned it. The answer, when she finally ran it down, surprised her less than it should have. The rock face and 40 acres behind it belonged to the Larkspur Mining and Improvement Company, which had surveyed it for silver 2 years prior, found nothing worth the powder, and marked it in the ledger as waste ground. The company's local agent was a narrow, well-tailored man named Josiah Pruitt, who also happened to hold the mortgage on half the buildings in town, and sat unofficially but unmistakably at the head of whatever passed for society in Larkspur Gulch. "Waste ground," Pruitt said, when Clara came to his office to inquire on account of the grade. "You can't run a wagon up that face, ma'am, let alone a foundation." He said ma'am the way some men said it, as a kind of gentle dismissal, a hand laid flat on a conversation to close it. I don't intend to run a wagon up it, Clara said. I intend to build into it. Pruitt looked at her for a moment as though she had spoken in a foreign tongue, then laughed briefly and not unkindly, the laugh of a man confident enough in his own understanding of the world that another person's strange idea registered to him as entertainment rather than threat. Into the rock. Yes. Mrs. Whitmore, I don't say this to insult you, but there's not a stonemason between here and Helena who'd take that commission, and if there were, it'd cost you more than the whole of that mountain is worth. I don't need a stonemason, Clara said. I need the deed. She paid $11 an acre, a price Pruitt said. She suspected as much to be rid of a peculiar transaction. As for any value he placed on the land, and by the end of the week, the 40 acres in the rock face belonged to Clara and Edmund Whitmore, recorded in the company ledger under a column that until then had never once contained a woman's name as principal purchaser. News of the sale moved through Larkspur Gulch the way news always moved through a camp too small to have a newspaper and too eager to need one. By the following Sunday, the story had acquired detail Clara had never supplied, that she meant to dig a mine of her own in the waste rock, that she was simple, that Edmund Whitmore had married a woman not right in the head and was too soft to correct her. She heard the last version from the mercantile owner's wife, a stout, not unkind woman named Delphine Ross, who told it to her as a kindness, a warning disguised as gossip, the way women sometimes warn each other of weather. They're saying you mean to build a house in the rock, Delphine said, weighing out flour, not quite meeting Clara's eyes. That's true, Clara said. Delphine's hands paused on the scale. In the rock. Into it, excavated, like a root cellar but larger and finished. Well, Delphine resumed, weighing, added an extra half-pound Clara had not asked for, and would not be charged for a habit Clara would come to recognize over the following months as the woman's particular way of taking sides without saying so aloud. I expect you know your own business. Not everyone extended the same courtesy. At a supper given by the Reverend Coates to welcome the new arrivals to the congregation, a mining engineer named Thomas Averill, employed by Pruitt's company, and proud in the manner of young men newly credentialed of the precision of his own training, asked Clara across the table whether she had considered the difficulty of ventilating a structure with no exterior wall to speak of. I have considered it at some length, Clara said. There's a chimney effect available if the excavation runs true to the seam, cool air drawn in low from the north face, where the shade holds longest, and warm air vented high through a shaft cut to daylight on the south crown. The rock itself becomes the flue in winter and the cellar in summer. It's the same principle your company uses to ventilate the deep workings at the Comstock, only run for comfort instead of ore. There was a silence at the table of the kind that follows a woman answering a question more precisely than the man who asked it expected to be answered. Averill recovered first with a small laugh meant to restore the room to its proper order. That's a fine theory, Mrs. Whitmore. I wonder how it will answer in practice with respect. So do I, Clara said. That's why I mean to build it and find out rather than simply theorize about it at supper. Edmund beside her said nothing, but she felt his hand find hers beneath the tablecloth, and later, walking home under a sky gone hard and bright with early stars, he said, You didn't need to best him quite so thoroughly. I didn't best him. I answered his question. You answered it in a way that will be repeated with unkind embellishment by tomorrow evening. It's already being repeated with unkind embellishment, Clara said. I'd rather they repeat something true. Edmund was quiet for a stretch of road, his breath showing pale in the cold. He was a tall man, stooped slightly from a life spent bent over books and desks, with the kind of face that looked perpetually on the verge of a private joke, though the joke more often than not was gentle and aimed at himself. I looked at your figures again last night, he said finally, the load calculations for the entry arch, and I understood perhaps a third of them, and the third I understood frightened me a little, and I've decided that's as good a reason as any to trust the other two-thirds. He glanced sideways at her. I married a woman who reads mountains, Clara. I didn't marry her expecting the mountain to always answer politely. She laughed, the first real laugh she'd had since the coach ride in, and did not let go of his hand for the rest of the walk. Ground was broken on the 14th of October. Clara hired 2 men, a Welshman named Griffiths, who had worked hard rock in Cornwall as a boy before his family emigrated, and who understood without being told twice what she meant by grain and fault and seam, and a younger man, half Shoshone and half Irish, named Peter Doyle, quiet and exact, who could set a drill hole truer than any man Clara had worked with in Pennsylvania. Between the 3 of them and Edmund, who could not swing a hammer with any particular skill, but could read a survey chain and keep a level line as well as any man she trained. They began the slow work of opening the mountain. It was not fast work, and Clara had never expected it to be. Hand drills and black powder, carefully placed and modestly charged, opened the entry in inches and feet, rather than the yards a man might clear in soft ground. Through October and into the first hard frosts of November, the four of them cut a portal 8 feet wide and just as tall into the base of the gray face following the seam Clara had marked that first morning. The granite coming away in slabs along planes she had read correctly, and in places, stubbornly along planes, she had not, requiring Griffiths to curse in Welsh and start the hole again. The town watched in the way small towns watch anything that promises to end either in triumph or humiliation, and offers in the meantime free entertainment. Men rode out on Sundays to look at the widening scar on the rock face and speculate within Clara's hearing, and beyond it on how long the Whitmores' money would hold before they gave it up and built a house of lumber like sensible people. Pruitt himself came once in November, watched the work for the better part of 20 minutes without dismounting his horse, and said only, "You've moved a good deal of rock, Mrs. Whitmore," in a tone that made it impossible to say whether he intended a compliment or an epitaph. "There's a good deal more to move," Clara said. "So I see." He looked past her at the raw portal, at the drill marks radiating from it like the rays of a child's drawing of the sun. "The bank is putting up a new building come spring, brick shipped up from Salt Lake. 3 stories. I'd have thought a woman of your evident skill in construction might have found more profitable employment than digging a hole in a hillside no one else wanted." "I'm not digging a hole, Mr. Pruitt," Clara said. "I'm building a house that won't care what the weather does." He smiled the smile of a man who has decided a conversation is not worth the trouble of winning. "Every house in this valley will stand through whatever weather comes, Mrs. Whitmore. This is Montana, not the Arctic." "I hope you're right," Clara said, and meant it, and did not believe it, and went back to marking the next line of drill holes before the light failed. By the time the first real snow closed the high passes in late November, the entry portal was cut and shored 12 feet into the face, and Clara stood at its mouth in the blue evening light, running her palm along the drill-scarred stone, feeling for the cold breath of air that told her the seam ran true and hollow beyond where they had yet cut. Behind her down in the valley, the lamps of Larkspur Gulch were coming up one by one in windows of green lumber that had not yet had a single winter to prove what it was made of. She had 2 years by her own reckoning to finish before the house needed to be whole. She did not yet know what would make 2 years feel in the end like exactly enough time and no more. Via tip het kekpart konlai, the YouTube metadata di, len ke what vit tip twanbo kochuin, the metadata YouTube. Len ke what vit tip twanbo kochuin, the metadata YouTube. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was, by the account of every old-timer in the valley, an ordinary one. Heavy snow through January, a false thaw in February, that flooded the lower creek crossing, then cold again until April. Clara took careful note of this. An ordinary winter told her what the mountain could withstand without extremity. She wanted to know the baseline before she built for what lay beyond it. Work on the house resumed in earnest with the spring melt. Through 1880, the portal Clara, Edmund, Griffiths, and Doyle had opened. The previous autumn grew inward and then outward again, branching into the chambers Clara had drawn first in her ledger and then more permanently in chalk lines on the rock itself. She oriented the main hall to catch the low winter sun through a south-facing gallery cut where the granite thinned toward a natural cleft, a decision that cost 3 extra weeks of careful, delicate blasting to avoid cracking the ceiling above it, but which meant that even in the shortest days of December, light would fall clear across the hearthstone by mid-morning. "You're building a house that follows the sun like a plant," Edmund said one evening, watching her chalk the angle of the gallery cut against a diagram of the solstice sun's path, worked out from an almanac and confirmed patiently over weeks of Clara standing on the hillside at dawn with a plumb line and a notebook. "I'm building a house that doesn't need to burn wood to stay warm," Clara said. "The sun does the work if you let it in at the right angle and keep it out at the wrong one. My father called it reading the year the way you read the stone, where the light wants to go and where it doesn't." Behind the main hall, deeper into the mountain, where the rock held a steady, unchanging cold, no matter the season above, they cut a cellar 3 chambers wide, lined with shelving hewn from the stone itself, cool enough in August to keep meat a fortnight past what any root cellar in town could manage. Clara stalked it through that first full year with a patience that struck even Edmund as extreme sacks of dried beans and cornmeal salted pork strings of onions, jars of preserved fruit put up from a small orchard. She'd talked a homesteading family into selling her the excess of coils of hemp rope, bought a little at a time from the mercantile, so as not to draw remark iron-digging bars. 2 dozen shovels of varying weight, and in a locked chamber of its own, 400 pounds of oats and hay pressed into bales for the horses she meant to stable in a side gallery. Cut for the purpose, its floor sloped and drained. Its walls thick enough that a horse's own body heat would keep the space above freezing, even in deep cold. Not all of this went unremarked. Delphine Ross, restocking Clara's flower order one week in September, glanced at the growing list and said, mild as ever, "You're laying in enough for a siege, Mrs. Whitmore." "I'm laying in enough for a winter I haven't seen yet," Clara said. "I'd rather buy a pound of beans I don't need in October than need a pound I don't have in January." "Folks are saying you mean to hole up like a bear." "Let them say it." Clara counted coins into Delphine's palm. "A bear that sleeps through the winter is the only animal in these mountains that never starves in one." Meanwhile, on the rise above the creek crossing, where the town's better lots had gone to auction, Josiah Pruitt was building a house of his own, a 3-story frame structure with gingerbread trim shipped up from a mill in Salt Lake City. Glazed windows, 12 panes to a sash, a wraparound porch, and that autumn a widow's walk added at the insistence of Pruitt's wife, who had seen one in an engraving of a New England sea captain's home, and wanted, she said, something that would let the town know exactly how far a person could see from the top of it. Clara watched it rise board by board over the same months her own house grew inward, invisible from the road, and found in the comparison something less like resentment than a kind of quiet, sorrowful recognition. She had built things for men like Pruitt before in Pennsylvania, houses meant to be seen from the road, calculated for admiration rather than for the particular weather of the particular place they stood in. She did not think Pruitt a fool exactly. She thought him a man who had never yet been made to answer for the difference between building to impress and building to survive, and who therefore had no reason to believe the difference mattered. "He's put 4 flues in that house," Edmund reported one evening back from an afternoon at the assayer's office, where talk ran to little else but the Pruitt residence's finer points. Avril was going on about the parquet floor shipped from Chicago. Apparently there's a room meant only for receiving callers. A parlor for a parlor's sake. How does he mean to heat it? Coal mostly hauled up from the railhead, wood for the rest. Clara said nothing further, but she thought that night of the coal wagons on the mountain roads, in a hard winter of a supply line running 40 miles to a railhead that could itself be cut by snow, and added the following week another half-ton of coal to her own cellar stores, bought slowly a sack at a time, so that no one in town would think to remark on the total. The signs began that autumn, though Clara would not have called them signs at the time. Only observations entered in her ledger, the way she had once entered the mileage of a washed-out road. The deer came down out of the high country in September, 3 weeks earlier, than old Mr. Kessler, who had trapped these mountains for 30 years, could remember them coming. The geese that usually crossed the valley in loose high skeins through October instead came low and urgent. In the last week of August, calling in a register, Kessler said he'd only heard twice before in his life, both times ahead of what he called a widowmaker winter. Kessler himself, a stooped, tobacco-stained man the town mostly tolerated as a curiosity, told anyone who'd listen that the bark on the north side of the pines had thickened unusual, that the squirrels were burying more than squirrels ought to need, that the old Shoshone families who wintered lower in the valley had moved their camp a full 2 weeks before their custom. "Man like that," Avril said at the mercantile counter within Clara's hearing, "makes his living telling folks the world's about to end. Every year it's the worst winter he's ever seen. One year he'll be right and take the credit for the other 9 he was wrong." Clara did not argue the point aloud. She went home and asked Peter Doyle, whose mother's people had wintered in this valley 3 generations before the Silver Camp existed, what he made of the geese. "My grandmother would already be moving the horses down," Doyle said. "She always said when the birds fly low and scared instead of high and lazy, they're not going somewhere, they're running from something." Clara wrote that down too. By the first week of November 1880, the house was, if not entirely finished, entirely sound. The main hall roofed in living rock, the ventilation shafts cut and tested, drawing a clean cold updraft that Clara confirmed by holding a candle flame to the intake grate and watching it bend and steady into the shaft. The stable held 2 horses and enough feed by her calculation to carry them 5 months without resupply. The cellar held food enough she believed for herself, Edmund Griffiths, and Doyle, who had by then largely moved his own small cabin's worth of belongings into a side chamber near the entrance. Having come over a year of shared labor to regard the mountain house less as an employer's project and more as something he had a hand in and a stake in, to see out a winter considerably worse than any this valley had yet produced. She had not built it, she told herself, because she believed with certainty that disaster was coming. She had built it because she had learned at 19, standing over her father's grave, beside a wall he had said would not hold, that the cost of believing a thing would probably be fine was a cost you did not get to negotiate after the fact. On the last evening of November, the sky over Larkspur Gulch went the color of a bruise an hour before sunset, a low, seamless gray violet that swallowed the mountains to the west before the sun itself had properly gone down. Clara stood at the mouth of the portal, with Edmund watching it come on, and felt something in the pressure of the air that she could not have named in words, but recognized in her chest, the way she recognized bad stone before her tools ever touched it. "That's an unkind color for a sky," Edmund said. "It is," Clara said, and went inside to bar the stable door and check one final time the seal on the cellar shelving, and did not sleep well, though she could not have said that night exactly what she was listening for. The snow began on the 2nd of December, 1880, not as a storm but as a settling, a fine dry powder that fell without wind for the better part of a day and gave no particular alarm to anyone in Larkspur Gulch. By the 3rd day the wind had come, and by the 4th no one in the valley could have told you where the road ended and the drifted field began. Clara marked the days in her ledger the way she had once marked road mileage, a habit that steadied her hands when there was little else to do with them. Day 1, snow no wind, 6 inches by dusk. Day 2, wind rising from the northwest, visibility under 30 feet by afternoon. By the 4th day, the wind had found a register Clara had never heard it hold before, a sustained, grinding howl that did not rise and fall the way ordinary wind did, but simply continued hour after hour until the sound stopped registering as sound and became instead a kind of pressure against the inside of the skull. Inside the mountain house, the noise reached them only as a distant, muffled moan through the ventilation shafts, the air itself scarcely stirring at the hearth, even as Clara knew it was tearing roofs from lesser buildings not half a mile below. They did not for the first several days know what was happening in the town. The portal doors, heavy plank and iron hung by Griffiths on hinges he'd forged himself. The previous spring held against drifts that piled 12, then 18 feet against the outer rock face, bearing the entrance entirely by the 5th day, beneath a hard-packed white wall through which only the ventilation shafts capped with iron grates and swept clear each morning by Doyle on a rope line still breathed. "We're blind down here," Edmund said on the 6th day, pacing the main hall in the lamplight, with the particular restlessness of a man whose usefulness had for the moment run out. "We don't know if the town's standing or gone. We'll know when the wind lets us look," Clara said, and went back to checking the horses, who stood calm and unbothered in their stone stable, eating hay from a store that would, by her calculation, outlast the storm by a considerable margin. It was on the 8th day, in the muffled quiet of a lull, that Doyle swore later was the eye of something rather than its end, that they heard it, a sound distinct even through 18 feet of packed snow and solid granite. A low structural groan followed seconds later by a crack. Clara felt in the soles of her boots before she consciously registered it as sound at all. It came from the direction of the valley, from the rise above the creek crossing, and Clara did not need to see it to know with the same certainty her father had once read a failing retaining wall exactly what had happened. Pruitt's house, its 4 flues, and its parquet floor, and its widow's walk, built to let a person see how far they could see, had gone down under the weight of snow. Its wide ornamental roof had never been pitched to shed, and its balloon frame walls raised fast and cheap. The previous spring had never been braced to hold against wind loads. No one building in this valley had thought until now to calculate for. Clara stood very still in the lamplight of the main hall, listening to a sound she could do nothing about, and felt something she would not, in later years, ever fully describe to anyone. Not triumph, nothing so simple or so ugly as that, but a grief made sharper by the knowledge that she had known, that she had said as much to the man's own engineer at a supper table more than a year before, and that knowing had bought her nothing but the sound of it happening anyway a mile off and utterly beyond her reach. "There's nothing we can do," Doyle said quietly beside her, reading her face. "Not tonight, not in this." "I know," Clara said. "I know that." And she went and sat by the hearth and did not speak again for the better part of an hour, while outside the wind rose once more and swallowed whatever sounds might have followed. The storm held 11 days in total, the longest sustained blizzard the valley's oldest residents. Those who survived to be asked could recall or had ever heard their own elders describe. It broke finally in the gray hour before dawn, on the 12th day of December, the wind falling away not gradually, but almost at once, as though a hand had been lifted from the throat of the sky, leaving behind a silence so complete that Clara, waking to it in the dim hall, thought for a moment she had gone deaf. She dressed in every layer the cellar held, roused Edmund and Doyle and Griffiths, and by first light the four of them were cutting through the packed drift at the portal mouth, with shovels and iron bars working in shifts against snow. So dense in places it had to be chipped rather than shoveled. Until past mid-morning, the last wall of white gave way, and gray daylight, thin and merciless, fell across the portal floor for the first time in 12 days. Clara climbed out onto the buried hillside and looked down into the valley, and the valley she had known for a year and 2 months no longer existed. Where Larkspur Gulch had stood its mercantile, its 11 saloons, its half-built Methodist church, its raw lumber homes, color of a fresh wound, there was now a single unbroken field of white, seamless from the ridge to the frozen creek, broken only by the black stubs of chimney tops and the bent finger of a flagpole she recognized after a moment as belonging to the schoolhouse. She counted the chimneys she could see. It was the first morning she would count them, though it would not, she already understood, be the last. Behind her, Edmund came up out of the portal, stood beside her, and said nothing at all because there was nothing in his considerable education that had prepared him with words for what lay below them. "We start now," Clara said, "while the light holds." They went down with rope, iron bars, 2 shovels apiece, and the coil of hemp Clara had bought a little at a time through 2 summers so that no one in town would remark on the total. Doyle went first, testing the crust of the drift with a probe bar at every third step, calling back the depth in a flat, steady voice that Clara found in the hours that followed more calming than any reassurance he could have offered in words. The first roofline they found belonged to the Kessler cabin low on the flat, where the old trapper had lived alone for 30 years, and Clara's hands were shaking, though not from cold by the time Griffiths broke through the collapsed shingles and called down into the dark. Kessler's voice came back thin, but whole, cursing the snow, the wind, and his own stubbornness in roughly equal measure. And when they pulled him up through the hole an hour later, half frozen and furious and alive, Clara sat down hard in the snow beside the opening and put her face in her gloved hands for the length of time it took Edmund to say her name twice. "I'm well," she said, and stood and went to the next roofline. The digging went that way for 4 days, each buried structure. A question Clara made herself ask without flinching before Griffiths or Doyle broke through the family of 5. Half a mile past the schoolhouse, the mother badly frostbitten, but the children huddled together under every quilt in the house, all breathing when the roof came open. The town's young doctor, Ansel Cray, found alive in his surgery beneath a collapsed ceiling that had, by some mercy of physics Clara would later study for its structural lesson rather than its luck, held just enough of an air pocket to spare him. An elderly widow, Mrs. Prager, found on the second day past saving. By the time they reached her, the first death Clara had to stand over and could not undo, and the one she carried longest afterward, though she told no one, not even Edmund, how long. Delphine Ross they found on the 3rd day alive, having kept her own family and 2 neighboring children fed through the storm on stores not so different in principle from Clara's own, laid in by a woman's plain good sense rather than a mason's calculation. When Griffiths pulled the last board free and Delphine's face appeared streaked and exhausted in the gray daylight, she looked up at Clara standing at the edge of the dug pit and said before anything else, "I never doubted you'd come." It was the Pruitt house that took longest on the 4th day. Its collapsed frame, a tangled ruin of splintered joists and shattered glazed windows that had to be cleared board by board rather than shoveled through, each timber sharp-edged and treacherous with ice. Clara worked beside Griffiths through the worst of it, saying little, and when at last they broke through into what had been the ornamental parlor, meant only for receiving callers, they found Josiah Pruitt alive, his coat wrapped around both his children, his wife beside him with a fractured arm she had not once complained of in whatever hours they had lain there in the dark, listening to the house come apart around them. Pruitt looked up at Clara through the broken ceiling, his face gray with cold and something beyond cold, and did not say anything at all. Not thanks, not apology, not the practiced ease of a man who had once called her project a hole in a hillside. No one wanted. He only looked at her for a long moment, in a silence that said more than any of his careful words at the supper table ever had, and then he reached up and Clara took his hand and pulled. By the end of the fourth day of digging, the mountain house held past 50 souls. Every survivor, Clara Edmund Griffiths and Doyle could find and carry or walk back up the buried slope to the portal, packed into the main hall and the cellar chambers, and even for the horses' sake, shared willingly half the stable. The cellar stores that had seemed through 2 patient summers of a pound at a time, almost excessive to Clara's own eye, now looked with 50 mouths to feed and no clear end to how long the roads below would stay impassable, uncomfortably close to insufficient. Rationing starts tomorrow, Clara said to Edmund that night, the two of them going over the stores by lamplight while the survivors slept exhausted packed shoulder to shoulder in a warmth none of them 3 days earlier would have believed a hole in a hillside could hold. Half portions on the grain. We stretch the salted pork with the beans. How long can we hold? 6 weeks if the roads stay closed longer than that. She closed the ledger. I hope to God they don't. The roads opened in the end 19 days after the storm broke, when a supply train from the county seat, alerted by a rider who had somehow made it out through the pass on the 4th day of clear weather, finally cut through to what remained of Larkspur Gulch. By then, Clara's rationing had held the mountain house's 50-odd occupants, thinner and harder-eyed than they had been 3 weeks before, but every one of them saved Mrs. Prager alive, to walk back down into a town that no longer in any meaningful sense existed. The town meeting was held not in the mercantile, which had partially collapsed, nor the church unfinished and now roofless, but in the main hall of the mountain house itself, the only structure in the valley large enough and sound enough to hold the whole of what was left of Larkspur Gulch at once. Clara stood at the front of it, not because she had asked to, but because no one in the 3 weeks since the digging began had suggested anyone else stand there instead. We could rebuild where the town stood, Reverend Coates said into a silence that had gone on rather a long time. Lumber's cheap. The mill at Bitterroot Crossing could have boards up here inside a month. And it'll come down again, Kessler said from the back, same as it did this time next time the sky turns that color again. It was Josiah Pruitt, still moving carefully, his ribs bandaged where a falling joist had cracked 2 of them, who spoke next, and the hall went quieter still to hear him. I built the finest house in this valley, he said. I put 4 flues in it, and glass shipped from Salt Lake, and a floor from Chicago, and none of it kept my children from spending 11 days in the cold not knowing if the roof would hold. Mrs. Whitmore built into a mountain the mining company called Waste Ground, and it's the reason there's a soul left in this valley to hold this meeting at all. He looked at Clara, and this time he did not need long to find words. I'd like to learn how she did it, and I'll put up the money to teach anyone else in this town who'd like to learn it too. They did not rebuild the town where it had stood. Through the following spring and summer of 1881, Larkspur Gulch moved board by board and stone by stone into the shoulder of the same ridge that held Clara's house, a scatter of new excavations opening along the granite face under Clara's direction, and increasingly under the direction of young men and women. She had begun, almost without meaning to train Peter Doyle chief among them, cutting his own lines now, with a confidence Clara no longer needed to check. Pruitt's money, freed from ornamental porches and widows' walks, went instead into a community hall of dressed stone at the center of the new settlement, its hearth large enough to seat 40, its walls 2 feet thick, and unlikely any engineer who examined them agreed to come down in any storm the Bitterroots had yet produced. Edmund wrote his book that winter and the next working at a desk cut into an alcove of the main hall with a window Clara had angled without being asked to catch the morning sun. He called it the Whitmore Method Stone Construction and Climate on the Northern Frontier, and though it found no publisher grander than a modest press in Helena, copies of it traveled over the following years further than either of them expected, to building committees in Wyoming, to a Norwegian settlement in the Dakota Territory, to a mining camp in Colorado, that wrote to ask whether Mrs. Whitmore herself might consider a visit. She did not visit most years. She stayed in the valley, and the valley slowly rebuilt itself into her image of it, not grand, not built to impress from the road, but built chamber by chamber to answer the year rather than defy it. Years afterward, in a summer when Clara's hair had gone the same gray as the granite she had spent her life reading, a young man rode in from the eastern slope with a letter of introduction from a rancher in the Dakotas who had lost a barn 2 winters running to weather he had not built for. He found Clara at the portal mouth of the old house, chalk in hand, marking a line into fresh stone for a cistern chamber a neighboring family had asked her to cut. Mrs. Whitmore, he said uncertain, turning his hat in his hands the way young men did when they had traveled a long way to ask something they were suddenly afraid might be foolish. Where do we begin? Clara set down her chalk and looked past him down the slope to the settlement of stone roofs, catching the last gold light of the afternoon smoke rising thin and even from a dozen chimneys that would not, she knew, come down in any wind this mountain could send against them. Listen to the mountain first, she said. It already knows what it's going to do. Your job is only to build something that agrees with it.